Sometimes, the most important moments in our lives come when we least expect them. In the harsh Wyoming winter of 1887, cattle baron Samuel Mackenzie thought he was just heading out to check on his herd before the storm hit. The blizzard came down harder and faster than anyone predicted, turning the familiar countryside into a deadly white maze. That's when he saw something that stopped him. Colder dog, barely alive, buried in the snow and fighting for every breath. Without thinking twice, Samuel pulled off his gloves and lifted the wounded animal into his wagon. "Get in my wagon now," he said, not knowing those words would change everything. As they rode through the storm together, Samuel discovered something hidden in the dog's collar that connected to a part of his past he'd tried to forget. What was it about this dying dog that would turn his world upside down? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Mackenzie Ranch stretched across 15,000 acres of prime Wyoming grassland, a testament to one man's unwavering determination and shrewd business sense. Samuel Mackenzie had built his empire from nothing, arriving in the territory 23 years earlier with little more than the clothes on his back and an iron will that refused to bend. Now, at 51, he owned the largest cattle operation in 3 counties, employed 37 men year-round, and had his brand burned into the hides of over 4,000 head of prime beef cattle. The ranch house itself stood like a fortress against the endless sky, its thick log walls and stone foundation built to withstand whatever nature might throw at it. Samuel had designed it himself, every beam and board placed with the precision of a man who left nothing to chance. The wide wraparound porch offered views in all directions, allowing him to survey his domain from the comfort of his leather chair with his morning coffee. Inside, the rooms were spacious but practical, furnished with sturdy pieces that would last generations. The walls displayed his achievement certificates from the Cattlemen's Association, photographs of prize-winning bulls, and the Mackenzie brand iron mounted prominently above the massive stone fireplace. Jake Morrison had been Samuel's foreman for 14 years, a weathered man of 45 whose loyalty ran as deep as the prairie roots. He'd ridden with Samuel through droughts, harsh winters, cattle rustlers, and market crashes, never once questioning a decision. Jake understood that Samuel Mackenzie was a man who calculated every risk, weighed every option, and never acted on impulse. It was this methodical nature that had built the ranch's reputation for reliability and success. "Storm's coming in faster than expected, Mr. Mackenzie," Jake announced as he stepped onto the porch that December morning, his breath forming white clouds in the frigid air. Barometers dropping like a stone. "Weather like this, we could lose stock if they get caught in the open." Samuel nodded, setting down his coffee cup with the deliberate motion that marked all his actions. He'd already noticed the signs, the way the horses moved restlessly in the corral, the unusual silence of the birds, the heavy grey clouds building on the western horizon like an advancing army. At 51, he'd lived through enough Wyoming winters to read the subtle language of approaching storms. "Which pastures are most exposed?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. The north section, where they'd moved 200 head just last week, offered little natural shelter. Those cattle would need to be moved to the protected valleys before the worst of the storm hit. "North section's the worst?" Jake confirmed. "We could lose 30, maybe 40 head if this turns into what I think it will. The creek bottoms would give them some protection, but we'd need to move them soon." The decision should have been simple: send the men to move the cattle and wait out the storm from the safety of the ranch house. Samuel had made such decisions hundreds of times before, always choosing the practical path that protected both livestock and men. But something felt different about this storm, something that stirred an uneasiness he couldn't quite identify. The town of Millbrook lay 12 miles south of the ranch, a modest community of 800 souls who depended on the surrounding ranches for their livelihood. Samuel made the journey twice a week for supplies and business, always taking the same route along the well-worn trail that followed Willow Creek. The townspeople respected him, though few could claim to know him well. He was a man who kept his own counsel, conducted his affairs with scrupulous honesty, and paid his debts on time. Dr. Harrison, the town physician, often remarked that Samuel Mackenzie was the most predictable man in the territoria, quality that some found admirable and others found somewhat cold. Martha Stevens, who ran the general store with her husband Tom, had known Samuel since his early days in the territory. She remembered the young man who'd worked 16-hour days building his first cabin, who'd gone without meals to save money for his first cattle purchase, who'd never spoken of the life he'd left behind in whatever place had shaped him into the focused, driven man who'd arrived in Wyoming. Over the years, she'd watched him build his empire with single-minded determination, but she'd also noticed something else, loneliness that seemed to deepen with each passing year, as if success had cost him something precious. The ranch employed men from all walks of life. There was young Tommy Patterson, barely 20, whose enthusiasm for ranch work reminded Samuel of his own younger self. Pedro Ramirez had worked cattle in Texas before drifting north, bringing with him an intuitive understanding of livestock that made him invaluable during difficult seasons. Old Bill Hawkins had been with Samuel almost from the beginning, a grizzled veteran of the frontier whose stories of earlier days provided entertainment during long winter evenings. Each man earned his wages through honest work, and Samuel treated them fairly, if not warmly. As the morning progressed, the signs of the approaching storm became more pronounced. The wind picked up, carrying with it the sharp scent of snow and the promise of bitter cold. The horses in the corral pressed together, their winter coats already thick, but somehow sensing that this storm would test even their hardy constitutions. The cattle in the nearer pastures began moving toward the natural windbreaks, following instincts honed by countless generations of survival. Samuel stood at his office window, studying the account books that documented his success. Every transaction was recorded in his precise handwriting, every profit and loss calculated to the penny. The numbers told the story of a man who'd turned determination into prosperity, who'd built something lasting in a land that broke weaker souls. But today, the familiar satisfaction of reviewing his achievements felt somehow hollow. The storm-weathered wagon sat in the barn, its wooden sides scarred by years of hard use, but still solid and dependable. Samuel had bought it during his third year in the territory, when the ranch was still more hope than reality. It had carried supplies through mud and snow, hauled hay to stranded cattle, and served as ambulance, freight hauler, and sometimes sleeping quarters during long roundups. The wagon was as much a part of the ranch's success as the cattle themselves, a tool that had proven its worth through seasons of service. As the wind began to howl around the ranch buildings, Samuel made a decision that would have surprised anyone who knew him well. Instead of sending his men into the storm, he decided to check the north pasture himself. Perhaps it was the restlessness that had been building in him for months, or maybe the need to prove to himself that age hadn't diminished his abilities. Whatever the reason, he began preparing for a journey that would take him into the teeth of what promised to be one of the worst storms of the winter. Jake protested, of course, arguing that such risks were better left to younger men. But Samuel's mind was made up, and when Samuel Mackenzie decided something, argument was pointless. He hitched his most reliable horse to the storm-weathered wagon, loaded it with supplies for emergency shelter, and set out into the gathering storm with the confidence of a man who'd never been defeated by mere weather. The blizzard struck with a ferocity that caught even Samuel by surprise. What had begun as scattered snowflakes quickly transformed into a wall of white that reduced visibility to mere yards. The wind howled across the prairie with such force that it rocked the wagon, and Samuel found himself leaning forward, squinting through the swirling snow to keep his bearings on the familiar trail. His horse, a sturdy mare named Belle who'd weathered many storms, pressed forward with the determination that had made her Samuel's favorite for such journeys. Her breath formed clouds of steam that were instantly whisked away by the wind, and ice began forming on her mane, despite the heavy blanket Samuel had thrown over her back. The wagon wheels cut deep tracks in the rapidly accumulating snow, each revolution becoming more difficult as the drifts deepened. Samuel had traveled this route hundreds of times, could navigate it blindfolded under normal conditions, but nothing about this storm was normal. The landmarks he relied upon the old oak tree struck by lightning 3 summers past. The distinctive rock formation that marked the halfway point to the north pasture had vanished behind curtains of wind-driven snow. The familiar prairie had become an alien landscape where every direction looked the same, and every step forward felt like a battle against nature itself. 20 minutes into the journey, Samuel began to question the wisdom of his decision. The storm was worsening by the minute, and what had seemed like a manageable risk from the warmth of his ranch house now felt like potential suicide. Belle was struggling, her usually steady gait becoming labored as she fought through snow that reached above her knees. The wind cut through Samuel's heavy coat as if it were made of paper, and he could feel the cold seeping into his bones despite his wool clothing and leather gloves. It was then, as he considered turning back, that he saw something that made him pull hard on the reins. Belle stopped gratefully, sides heaving as she caught her breath in the temporary shelter of a small rise that blocked the worst of the wind. Samuel wiped the snow from his eyes and stared hard at what had caught his attention. A dark shape barely visible against the white ground, perhaps 30 yards to his left. At first he thought it might be a fallen branch or a piece of debris blown by the wind, but something about the way it lay, the subtle movement that persisted despite the violence of the storm, made him look closer. As his eyes adjusted to the swirling snow, Samuel realized with a shock that he was looking at an Animala dog. By the size and shape of Ithalf, buried in a drift and moving weakly in what appeared to be a desperate attempt to free itself. Samuel's practical mind immediately catalogued the situation. The animal was clearly in distress, probably injured, certainly freezing. In weather like this, exposure meant death within hours, if not minutes. The sensible thing would be to note the location and return with help once the storm passed, though by then it would almost certainly be too late. Every moment of hesitation reduced the creature's chances of survival. But something deeper than practical considerations moved Samuel Mackenzie in that moment. Perhaps it was the sight of a living thing fighting against overwhelming odds, or maybe the recognition of a fellow creature caught unprepared by nature's fury. Without allowing himself time to reconsider, Samuel secured the reins and climbed down from the wagon, immediately sinking knee-deep into the snow. The journey to the dog's location took several minutes of hard struggling through drifts that sometimes reached his waist. The wind buffeted him with such force that he had to brace himself with each step, and the cold bit at his exposed face like needles. When he finally reached the animal, Samuel's heart clenched at what he found. It was indeed a dog, larger than most he'd seen, with the build and bearing of a working animal rather than a pet. Its coat was thick and dark, probably black or dark brown, under the coating of snow and ice, and its breathing came in labored pants that created small clouds in the frigid air. One hind leg was bent at an unnatural angle, clearly broken, and there were cuts visible on its muzzle and flanks where it had apparently struggled against sharp ice or debris. What struck Samuel most was the intelligence in the animal's eyes. Despite its pain and exhaustion, the dog watched him approach with an awareness that seemed almost human. There was no fear in its gaze, only a kind of desperate hope, as if it understood that this human represented its only chance of survival. "Easy there, boy," Samuel said softly, though his words were nearly lost in the wind. He wasn't even certain of the animal's gender, but something about its size and bearing suggested male. "Let's see what we can do about getting you out of this mess." The dog made no attempt to bite or snap as Samuel carefully examined its injuries. The broken leg was the most serious concern, but there were also signs of exhaustion and exposure that suggested the animal had been fighting the storm for hours. Its body temperature felt dangerously low, even through its thick coat, and Samuel knew that time was running short for both of them. Lifting the dog required careful maneuvering to avoid causing further injury to the broken leg. The animal was heavier than Samuel had expected, probably 70 or 80 pounds of solid muscle and bone, and the awkward positioning made it difficult to get a secure grip. But the dog seemed to understand what Samuel was trying to do and remained perfectly still during the process, even when movement must have caused considerable pain. The trek back to the wagon was even more difficult with the added weight and bulk of the injured animal. Samuel found himself stopping frequently to rest and regain his footing in the treacherous snow. His arms ached from the strain, and his back protested the awkward carrying position, but something about the dog's patient endurance of its pain inspired Samuel to push through his own discomfort. "Get in my wagon now," Samuel said as he reached the vehicle, speaking more to himself than to the dog as he maneuvered the animal into the wagon bed. He arranged several thick blankets around the dog, creating a nest that would provide both warmth and protection from the worst jolting of the journey home. The leather dog collar was barely visible beneath the matted, frozen fur around the animal's neck. Samuel noticed it only briefly as he arranged the blankets, noting that it appeared to be of good quality leather, well made and probably expensive. Whatever this dog's story might be, it was clearly not a common stray. The collar suggested an owner who cared enough to invest in quality equipment, which raised questions about how the animal had ended up alone and injured in one of the worst blizzards in recent memory. As Samuel climbed back onto the wagon seat and took up the reins, the dog lifted its head and fixed him with that same intelligent gaze. There was something in those eyes that Samuel couldn't quite interpret, a depth of understanding that seemed beyond what he'd expect from even the smartest animals he'd known. For just a moment, he had the unsettling feeling that the dog was trying to communicate something important, something that went beyond simple gratitude for the rescue. The journey back to the ranch took twice as long as the outbound trip. The storm continued to worsen, and several times Samuel feared they might become completely lost in the whiteout conditions. Belle struggled valiantly through the deepening snow, but her pace slowed considerably as the drifts reached dangerous depths. Behind him, Samuel could hear the dog's labored breathing and occasional soft whimpers of pain as the wagon jolted over rough terrain. By the time the ranch buildings finally came into view through the swirling snow, Samuel was exhausted and half frozen. His hands were so numb he could barely grip the reins, and his feet had lost all feeling despite his heavy boots. But the sight of his home, solid and welcoming with warm light glowing from the windows, filled him with a relief that surprised him with its intensity. The dog, too, seemed to sense their arrival, lifting its head to look toward the approaching shelter. The warmth of the ranch house enveloped Samuel like an embrace as he carried the injured dog through the front door. Jake Morrison was waiting, having watched through the window as the wagon struggled through the final 100 yards to the house. His weathered face showed both relief at Samuel's safe return and concern about the unconscious burden in his employer's arms. "What in blazes have you got there, Mr. Mackenzie?" Jake asked, taking one end of the blanket-wrapped dog to help ease the load. "Please tell me you didn't risk your neck in this storm for a stray animal." Samuel didn't answer immediately, too focused on getting the dog settled near the massive stone fireplace where the heat would begin working against the dangerous cold that had settled into the animal's body. The medical kit he kept for treating injured ranch hands sat in a wooden cabinet nearby, stocked with bandages, antiseptic, and basic surgical supplies. He'd learned through hard experience that on a remote ranch, every man needed to know something about treating injuries, whether in animals or humans. "Found him half dead in a snowdrift," Samuel finally explained, kneeling beside the dog and carefully unwrapping the blankets. "Broken leg, probably been fighting that storm for hours. Another 30 minutes and he'd have been gone." Jake shook his head, though his expression showed grudging admiration rather than criticism. In 14 years of working for Samuel Mackenzie, he'd learned that his employer never acted without reason, even when those reasons weren't immediately apparent. Still, risking human life for an injured animal struck him as uncharacteristically sentimental. "Well, he's a handsome devil, I'll give you that," Jake admitted, studying the dog's unconscious form. Even injured and exhausted, the animal showed signs of exceptional breeding and conditioning. His coat, beneath the ice and matted fur, was thick and lustrous. His build suggested both strength and speed, the kind of working dog that could be worth considerable money to the right owner. Samuel began his examination with the systematic approach he brought to all problems. The broken leg was the most obvious injury, but he checked carefully for other damage that might not be immediately visible. The cuts on the dog's muzzle and flanks were superficial, probably caused by struggling through ice-crusted snow. More concerning was the animal's low body temperature and signs of severe exhaustion. "Help me get some warm water and clean cloths," Samuel instructed. "We need to get his body temperature up gradually, and that leg needs to be set properly, or he'll never walk right again." The next hour passed in careful, methodical work. Samuel cleaned and dressed the wounds, applied warm compresses to combat the hypothermia, and carefully examined the broken leg to determine the best approach for setting it. The dog remained unconscious throughout most of the process, though occasionally he would stir slightly when Samuel's ministrations caused particular discomfort. It was Jake who first noticed something unusual about their patient. While Samuel worked on preparing a splint for the broken leg, Jake had been studying the dog's general condition and noticed details that suggested this was no ordinary ranch dog or stray. "Mr. Mackenzie, take a look at this animal's paws," Jake said quietly. "These aren't the feet of a dog that spent much time running wild. Look at the condition of those pads, the way his nails are trimmed. Someone's been taking real good care of this fellow." Samuel paused in his work to examine what Jake had noticed. Indeed, the dog's feet showed signs of regular care and attention. The pads, while tough enough for outdoor work, weren't the heavily scarred, rock-hard surfaces typical of dogs that lived rough. The nails had been professionally trimmed, and there were no signs of the cuts and scrapes that would be expected from a dog surviving on its own. "You're right," Samuel agreed. "This is somebody's valuable animal. Question is, what was he doing out in that storm, and where's his owner?" The leather collar around the dog's neck provided another clue to his pampered background. Samuel had noticed it during the rescue, but hadn't examined it closely. Now, in the warm light of the fireplace, he could see that it was indeed high-quality leather, well-oiled and expertly crafted. The buckle was solid brass, polished but showing signs of regular use. "That's a $20 collar if it's worth a penny," Jake observed. "Maybe more. Whoever owns this dog isn't hurting for money." As if responding to their conversation, the dog began to show signs of returning consciousness. His breathing became more regular, and his eyelids fluttered occasionally. Samuel continued working on the splint, fashioning it from straight pieces of wood and soft leather strips that would hold the broken bone in proper alignment, while allowing for the swelling that would inevitably follow. When the dog's eyes finally opened fully, Samuel was struck again by the intelligence he saw there. The animal studied his surroundings with obvious awareness, taking in the unfamiliar room, the two men working over him, and his own condition with what seemed like rational assessment rather than animal confusion. "Easy, boy," Samuel said softly, placing a gentle hand on the dog's head. "You're safe now. Just rest while we finish fixing up that leg." To Samuel's surprise, the dog seemed to understand not just the tone, but the content of his words. Instead of struggling or showing signs of panic at finding himself in strange surroundings, the animal relaxed visibly and watched the splinting process with calm attention. "I'll be damned," Jake muttered. "It's like he knows what you're doing and why you're doing it. Never seen an animal act quite like that." The splinting process required careful positioning and considerable manipulation of the injured leg. With most animals, this would have meant restraints and possibly sedation to prevent them from injuring themselves or their rescuers. But this dog lay perfectly still throughout the procedure, occasionally whimpering softly when the pain became acute, but never attempting to pull away or bite. As Samuel worked, he found himself talking to the animal in low, reassuring tones. He'd never been particularly sentimental about animals, viewing them as valuable assets that deserved proper care but not emotional attachment. Yet something about this dog's stoic endurance of pain and obvious gratitude for help stirred feelings he hadn't experienced in years. "There," Samuel said finally, securing the last leather tie on the splint. "That should hold everything in place while the bone heals. You'll be walking again in a few weeks, though you might always have a slight limp." The dog lifted his head slightly to examine Samuel's work, then looked directly into his rescuer's eyes, with an expression that seemed almost human in its depth of understanding. For a moment, Samuel had the unsettling feeling that the animal was trying to communicate something specific, something important, that went beyond simple gratitude. Jake, watching this exchange, shook his head in wonderment. "Mr. Mackenzie, I've worked around animals all my life, and I've never seen anything quite like this. It's almost like he's trying to tell you something." Samuel felt the same impression, but kept his thoughts to himself. The practical part of his mind insisted that he was reading too much into normal animal behavior, attributing human characteristics to what was simply a well-trained dog responding to kind treatment. But another part of him, a deeper intuition that he rarely acknowledged, suggested that there was indeed something unusual about their unexpected guest. The immediate crisis had passed, but Samuel knew the dog would need careful nursing over the next several days. The hypothermia and exhaustion would take time to overcome completely, and the broken leg would require monitoring to ensure proper healing. For now, though, the animal seemed stable and comfortable, resting near the fireplace where the warmth could continue its healing work. 3 days after the rescue, the dog had made remarkable progress toward recovery. His appetite had returned with a vengeance, and he consumed the carefully prepared meals Samuel provided with obvious relish. The broken leg remained immobilized in its splint, but the swelling had begun to subside, and there were no signs of infection in any of his wounds. Most remarkably, his energy and alertness had rebounded to levels that suggested exceptional physical conditioning before his ordeal. Samuel found himself spending considerable time observing the animal, drawn by behaviors that seemed increasingly unusual for an ordinary dog. The creature showed a level of intelligence and training that went far beyond simple obedience. When Samuel spoke to him, the dog would cock his head in a listening posture that suggested genuine comprehension rather than mere response to tone of voice. "Watch this, Jake," Samuel said on the morning of the 4th day, gesturing for his foreman to observe. He faced the dog, who was resting on a thick blanket near the fireplace, and spoke in a normal conversational tone. "We need to figure out what to call you, don't we, boy? Can't keep saying, 'Hey, you,' forever." The dog's response was immediate and unmistakable. He lifted his head, fixed his attention directly on Samuel's face, and made a soft sound that was neither bark nor whine, but something closer to an attempt at vocalization. His tail, which had remained relatively still during his recovery, began a gentle wagging motion. "I'll be switched," Jake muttered. "It's like he understood every word you said." Samuel knelt beside the dog and spoke again, this time with a more specific command. "Can you sit up, boy? Show us how well you're feeling." Despite the splinted leg that should have made the movement awkward, the dog carefully maneuvered himself into a sitting position, balancing expertly to compensate for his injury. He held the position steadily, watching Samuel's face for further instructions with the focused attention of a soldier awaiting orders. "That's not normal dog behavior," Jake said flatly. "That's the kind of response you'd expect from an animal that's had professional training, expensive professional training." Samuel's curiosity about the dog's background had been growing daily. The high-quality collar, the exceptional breeding, the obvious conditioning and training, all pointed to an animal of considerable value. But perhaps most puzzling was how such a well-cared-for dog had ended up alone and injured in one of the worst blizzards in recent memory. That afternoon, Dr. Harrison made his weekly visit to the ranch to check on the general health of the crew. Samuel had mentioned the rescued dog in passing, and the physician expressed interest in examining the animal both from professional curiosity and to ensure that the injury was healing properly. Dr. Harrison was a man of 62 years who had served as the territory's primary physician for over 3 decades. He treated everything from gunshot wounds to difficult births, and his experience with both human and animal injuries was extensive. When he examined the dog, his findings confirmed Samuel's growing suspicions about their guest's background. "This is a remarkable animal, Samuel," the doctor said after completing his examination. "The bone is healing beautifully, which suggests excellent general health and nutrition before the injury. But more than that, look at his overall condition, the muscle tone, the coat quality, the dental health. This dog has received the kind of care that costs serious money." The doctor's trained hands moved over the dog's body with professional thoroughness, checking for signs of other injuries or health problems. The animal submitted to the examination with the same patient cooperation he'd shown Samuel, never once showing signs of fear or aggression, despite what must have been uncomfortable handling. "There's something else," Dr. Harrison continued, his fingers exploring the area around the dog's collar. "The way he's been trained to accept handling like this suggests he's had regular veterinary care. Most dogs, even friendly ones, show some resistance to this kind of examination. This fellow acts like he's been through it many times before." Samuel had been thinking along similar lines, and the doctor's confirmation strengthened his growing conviction that this was no ordinary stray. The collar itself had become a source of particular interest. While cleaning the dried blood and mud from the dog's fur, Samuel had noticed that the leather showed signs of having been fitted by a professional, with precise measurements and careful adjustment of the buckle holes. "Have you examined the collar closely?" Samuel asked. "It might tell us something about where he came from." The three men, Samuel, Jake, and Dr. Harrison, gathered around the resting dog to take a closer look at the leather collar. What they found was both impressive and puzzling. The leather was indeed of exceptional quality, probably made by a craftsman rather than mass-produced. The brass fittings were solid and well-made, and the stitching showed the kind of attention to detail that marked expensive custom work. But it was Jake who noticed something that the others had missed. Running his fingers along the collar's inner surface, he felt a slight irregularity in what should have been smooth leather. "There's something odd here," he said, working his fingertips carefully along the collar's length. "Feels like there might be something sewn into the leather itself, some kind of padding or reinforcement maybe." Dr. Harrison, with his surgeon's sensitivity to texture and irregularities, took over the examination. His more experienced fingers quickly confirmed Jake's observation and went further, identifying what felt like a deliberate modification to the collar's construction. "This isn't padding," the doctor said slowly. "This feels like a hidden compartment of some kind. The leather's been doubled over and stitched to create a pocket or pouch. It's so well done that you'd never notice it unless you were looking for it specifically." The discovery raised immediate questions about whether they should attempt to investigate the hidden compartment. The collar was clearly valuable property belonging to whoever owned the dog, and Samuel's strong sense of personal ethics made him reluctant to tamper with another man's possessions. At the same time, the mystery of the dog's presence and the unusual features of his equipment suggested that there might be important information hidden in the collar. "Could be ownership papers," Jake suggested, "or maybe information about the dog's breeding and training. Valuable animals sometimes carry documentation with them." Samuel wrestled with the ethical implications while studying the dog's intelligent face. The animal seemed to be following their conversation with remarkable attention, his head turning from speaker to speaker as if he understood not just the words, but their significance. "What do you think, boy?" Samuel asked, addressing the dog directly. "Is there something in that collar we need to know about?" The dog's response was immediate and startling. He struggled to his feet despite the awkwardness of the splintered leg, moved closer to Samuel, and deliberately lowered his head in a gesture that clearly presented the collar for examination. His behavior was so obviously intentional that all three men fell silent in amazement. "Well, I'll be damned," Dr. Harrison said softly. "If I didn't know better, I'd say he just gave us permission to look." Samuel looked into the dog's eyes and saw something that convinced him they were meant to investigate the collar's secret. There was an urgency in the animal's gaze, a sense of importance that suggested the hidden compartment contained more than simple identification papers. "All right, boy," Samuel said quietly. If you're sure about this, we'll take a look, but we'll be careful not to damage anything. As Samuel began the delicate process of examining the collar more closely, searching for the best way to access the hidden compartment without causing damage, the dog settled beside him with obvious patience. Whatever secrets the collar held, the animal seemed determined that they should be revealed. Samuel's fingers worked carefully along the collar's inner edge, searching for the opening to the hidden compartment that Dr. Harrison had detected. The leather was so expertly crafted that finding the access point required patience and delicate touch. Jake and the doctor watched in silence as Samuel explored every inch of the collar's construction, looking for the craftsman's solution to concealing whatever lay within. After several minutes of careful examination, Samuel found what he was looking for. Hidden beneath a small leather flap that had been dyed to match the collar perfectly, he discovered a series of tiny stitches that could be carefully loosened without damaging the overall construction. The person who had created this hiding place had been both skilled and thoughtful, designing it to be accessed when necessary, but invisible to casual observation. "Got it," Samuel said quietly, using his pocket knife to carefully cut the nearly invisible threads. "Whoever made this knew what they were doing. This is professional work." As the hidden flap came loose, Samuel could see that there was indeed a small compartment sewn into the collar's thickness. Something was definitely inside. He could feel the edges of what seemed to be folded paper or perhaps thin leather. His heart began beating faster as he realized that whatever had been hidden so carefully was about to be revealed. With infinite care, Samuel reached into the compartment and withdrew its contents. What he found made his breath catch in his throat and caused his hands to tremble in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. Wrapped in a small piece of oiled cloth were two items that would change everything he thought he knew about his carefully ordered life. The first was a photograph, small enough to fit in the palm of his hand, but clear enough to show every detail despite its size. The second was a folded piece of paper that appeared to be a letter, written in a feminine hand that Samuel recognized with a shock that felt like a physical blow. Jake and Dr. Harrison watched Samuel's face transform as he studied the photograph. The color drained from his weathered features, and for a moment he looked as if he might collapse. His hands shook as he held the small image, and his breathing became shallow and rapid. "Mr. Mackenzie?" Jake asked with concern. "What is it? What's in that picture?" Samuel couldn't speak for a long moment. The photograph showed a young woman of perhaps 25, with dark hair and eyes that were unmistakably familiar. She was holding a small child, a boy of perhaps 3 years old, who shared her delicate features and dark coloring. Both were smiling at the camera with the kind of natural joy that spoke of genuine happiness and love. But it wasn't the beauty of the subjects or the quality of the photograph that had shocked Samuel into silence. It was the recognition that hit him like a thunderbolt. The woman in the picture was his daughter, Margaret, whom he hadn't seen in over 4 years. The child she held, the grandson he had never met, looked back at him from the photograph with eyes that reminded Samuel painfully of his own reflection. "This is my daughter," Samuel whispered, his voice barely audible, "and my grandson." Jake and Dr. Harrison exchanged glances of amazement. In all their years of knowing Samuel Mackenzie, neither had ever heard him mention having family. He had always seemed to be a man entirely alone in the world, with no connections beyond his ranch and his business relationships. With hands that continued to tremble, Samuel carefully unfolded the letter that had accompanied the photograph. The paper was of good quality, but showed signs of having been handled many times, as if the writer had struggled over every word. The feminine handwriting was indeed Margaret's, and as Samuel began to read, the careful control he had maintained over his emotions for so many years began to crack. "My dearest Papa," the letter began, and those 3 words alone were enough to bring tears to Samuel's eyes. "I know you may never forgive me for the things I said when I left, and I know I have no right to ask for your help after all these years of silence. But I am desperate, and you are the only person in the world who might be able to save us." Samuel had to stop reading for a moment to compose himself. The formal, distant relationship he had maintained with his own emotions was crumbling in the face of his daughter's words. Jake started to speak, but Dr. Harrison quietly motioned for silence, recognizing that Samuel needed time to process whatever revelations the letter contained. "The man I married," the letter continued, "is not the person I thought he was. Thomas seemed kind and gentle when we met, but after our wedding he became cruel and violent. I have tried to protect little Samuelise. Papa, I named him for you, but I fear for both our lives. Thomas has gambling debts that have brought dangerous men to our door, and he has begun talking about selling everything we own and disappearing to avoid his creditors." The letter went on to describe a situation that filled Samuel with rage and helplessness in equal measure. His daughter was trapped in an abusive marriage with a man who had squandered her small inheritance and now threatened both her and the child with his irresponsible behavior. She was living in fear, isolated from any support system, with nowhere to turn for help. "I know I wounded you deeply when I chose Thomas over your advice," Margaret wrote. "I know I said things that can never be taken back about your coldness and your inability to show love. I was young and foolish, and I believed that passion was more important than wisdom. I have learned how wrong I was, but that knowledge comes too late to save me from the consequences of my choices." Samuel remembered that final argument with painful clarity. Margaret had been 21, beautiful and headstrong, determined to marry a charming drifter who had swept her off her feet with romantic gestures and pretty words. Samuel had tried to warn her, had investigated the man's background and discovered debts, failed businesses, and a pattern of using women to solve his financial problems. But Margaret had refused to listen, had accused Samuel of being unable to understand love because he had never learned to show it himself. The words had cut deep because Samuel feared they contained more truth than he wanted to admit. He had indeed struggled to express the deep love he felt for his daughter, had hidden his emotions behind practical concerns and protective instincts that she interpreted as coldness. When she left with Thomas Brennan, Samuel had told himself it was for the best she would learn her lesson and return when she was ready to appreciate his wisdom. But years had passed without word, and Samuel's pride had prevented him from making the first move toward reconciliation. He had convinced himself that Margaret was happy with her choice and had no need for her father's presence in her life. The photograph and letter revealed how catastrophically wrong he had been. "We are living in a cabin near Deadwood," the letter continued, "but Thomas speaks constantly of moving on when his creditors get too close. I have managed to save a small amount of money, but it would not last long if we were forced to run. I am writing this letter in secret, and I pray that somehow it will reach you and that you will find it in your heart to forgive a foolish daughter who finally understands the value of her father's love." The final paragraphs of the letter explained the presence of the dog and the hidden message. Margaret had befriended a man named Connor Walsh, a bounty hunter who had been tracking Thomas for his unpaid debts. Walsh had agreed to carry the letter to Samuel, using his trained dog as a messenger in case he encountered trouble on the journey. The dog had been taught to find the Mackenzie ranch and deliver the collar to Samuel if anything happened to his master. "Connor promised me that Rex would find you no matter what obstacles he encountered," Margaret wrote. "He said Rex was the smartest dog he'd ever trained, and that he would complete his mission even if it cost him his life. If you are reading this letter, then something has happened to Connor, and Rex has succeeded in bringing my message to you, despite whatever dangers he faced." Samuel looked up from the letter to find the dog, Rex watching him with those intelligent eyes that now seemed even more remarkable. The animal had traveled through a deadly blizzard, had fought through injury and exhaustion, had literally risked his life to deliver a message from a daughter to her father. The loyalty and determination that had brought him to the Mackenzie ranch represented a devotion that Samuel found both humbling and inspiring. "She needs help," Samuel said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "My daughter and grandson are in danger, and I drove them away with my own stubborn pride." Dr. Harrison placed a gentle hand on Samuel's shoulder. "You couldn't have known, Samuel. Parents and children often say things in anger that they later regret. What matters now is what you do with this knowledge." But Samuel was already thinking beyond regret to action. The practical, methodical mind that had built his ranch empire was now focused on a new problem: how to help his daughter escape from a dangerous situation and bring his family home safely. The letter was dated nearly 2 weeks earlier, which meant that Margaret's situation might have changed dramatically in the intervening time. Every day of delay could make the difference between rescue and tragedy. Rex continued to watch Samuel with obvious expectation, as if he understood that his mission was only half complete. He had delivered the message successfully, but the response, the action that would determine whether his master's sacrifice had meaning, still lay ahead. Samuel read the letter 3 more times, each reading revealing new layers of desperation and fear in his daughter's carefully chosen words. The formal tone, she maintained, couldn't completely hide the terror that had driven her to reach out to the father she had rejected 4 years earlier. Between the lines, Samuel could read a story of gradual disillusionment and growing danger that made his heart ache with regret and fury. "Thomas has begun drinking more heavily," one passage revealed, "and when he drinks, his temper becomes unpredictable. Little Samuel has learned to hide when his stepfather comes home in that condition, and I fear what lessons my son is learning about what it means to be a man." The image of his grandson, a boy he had never met cowering in fear from a violent stepfather, filled Samuel with a cold rage that surprised him with its intensity. He had always prided himself on his rational, measured responses to problems, but the thought of a 3-year-old child living in terror awakened something primitive and protective that had nothing to do with reason. Jake, watching his employer's face, recognized the signs of a dangerous mood building in Samuel Mackenzie. In 14 years of working together, he had seen Samuel angry exactly twice, and both occasions had resulted in swift, decisive action that left lasting impressions on those who had crossed him. The controlled fury building behind Samuel's eyes now suggested that someone was about to learn why it was unwise to threaten what Samuel considered his own. "The men Thomas owes money to came to the cabin last week," the letter continued. "They were not the kind of men who accept excuses or pleas for more time. Their leader, a man called Donovan, made it clear that if Thomas cannot pay his debts soon, they will take compensation in other ways." The way he looked at me when he said this made my blood run cold. Dr. Harrison, reading over Samuel's shoulder, shook his head grimly. "I've heard of this Donovan. He runs a gambling operation out of Deadwood, and his methods of debt collection are notorious throughout the territory. If Margaret and the child are caught up in his business, they're in serious danger." Samuel folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the oiled cloth wrapping, but kept the photograph in his hands. The faces of his daughter and grandson seemed to look back at him with silent appeals for help that cut through his heart like knives. 4 years of stubborn pride and wounded feelings suddenly seemed like the most foolish waste of time he could imagine. The handwritten letter had been written in obvious haste, with several words crossed out and rewritten. Samuel could picture Margaret working by candlelight, struggling to find words that would bridge the gap their quarrel had created, while conveying the urgency of her situation. The fact that she had risked everything to send this message spoke to desperation beyond anything Samuel had ever experienced. "She mentions that this Connor Walsh was tracking Thomas for his debts," Samuel said, thinking aloud. "If something happened to Walsh, then Thomas and his creditors probably know that someone was closing in on them. That could make them more dangerous, more likely to run or do something desperate." Rex, lying beside the fireplace with his splinted legs stretched out for comfort, lifted his head at the mention of his former master's name. The intelligence in his eyes seemed tinged with sadness now, as if he understood that Connor Walsh was gone and that his mission had cost the bounty hunter his life. Samuel knelt beside the dog and spoke to him with new respect and understanding. "You did it, boy. You got through that storm and delivered the message just like you were trained to do. Connor would be proud of how you handled yourself." Rex's tail moved slightly, and he made a soft sound that might have been acknowledgement or grief. The bond between the dog and his deceased master had clearly been strong, and Samuel realized that Rex was probably mourning his loss even as he completed his final mission. The practical side of Samuel's mind was already working on the logistics of a rescue mission. Deadwood was 3 days hard riding under good conditions, but winter travel would make the journey longer and more dangerous. He would need supplies, weapons, and men he could trust in a fight. Most importantly, he would need accurate information about Margaret's exact location and the nature of the threats she faced. "Jake," Samuel said, his voice taking on the crisp authority that marked his business decisions, "I want you to pick 3 of our best men riders who can handle themselves in a fight and who won't ask too many questions. We'll need supplies for a week's travel and enough ammunition for a small war." Jake nodded without hesitation. "Tommy Patterson's young, but he's steady in a crisis. Pedro knows the country around Deadwood better than most. And old Bill's been in more scrapes than the rest of us combined. They'll do whatever you need them to do." Dr. Harrison cleared his throat diplomatically. "Samuel, I understand your urgency, but charging into Deadwood without knowing exactly what you're facing could make things worse for Margaret and the boy. Dangerous men like Donovan don't respond well to direct confrontation. They're more likely to take hostages or disappear entirely if they feel threatened." Samuel knew the doctor was right, but the need to take immediate action warred with the strategic thinking that had made him successful in business. Every hour of delay felt like a betrayal of his daughter's trust, yet acting without proper information could result in disaster. "What do you suggest?" Samuel asked, though his tone made it clear that any suggestion involving lengthy delays would not be well received. "Send someone ahead to scout the situation," Dr. Harrison replied. "One man, traveling fast and asking careful questions, could give you the intelligence you need to plan an effective rescue. Pedro knows Deadwood, and he's got the kind of face that doesn't attract attention." The suggestion made tactical sense, but Samuel's newly awakened paternal instincts rebelled against any plan that didn't involve immediate action. The photograph of his grandson seemed to burn in his hand, a constant reminder of innocence under threat while he sat in comfort debating strategies. Rex struggled to his feet and approached Samuel with obvious intention. Despite his injury, the dog moved with purpose, carrying something small in his mouth that he had apparently retrieved from somewhere in the room. When he reached Samuel, he dropped the object at his feet and sat back on his haunches with an air of having completed another part of his mission. Samuel picked up what Rex had brought him and found himself holding a small brass button, tarnished but still showing traces of military insignia. It was the kind of button that might come from a uniform jacket, and Samuel recognized it immediately as belonging to Connor Walsh. The bounty hunter must have pressed it into Rex's mouth during his final moments, knowing that his dog would deliver it along with the more obvious message. But this button told a story beyond just identification. Samuel's experienced eye recognized the markings of a cavalry unit, and the wear pattern suggested it had been carried as a keepsake rather than worn on an active uniform. Connor Walsh had been a military man, probably a veteran of the Indian Wars, and he had kept this memento of his service throughout his civilian career. "He was one of us," Samuel said quietly, understanding now why Walsh had been willing to risk his life to help a desperate woman and her child. A soldier who couldn't turn his back on people in need. The discovery of the button added another layer of obligation to Samuel's growing sense of responsibility. Not only did he owe it to his daughter and grandson to attempt a rescue, but he also owed it to Connor Walsh's memory to complete the mission that had cost the bounty hunter his life. Rex had carried more than just a message through that blizzard. He had carried a torch of duty that now passed to Samuel Mackenzie. The sound of approaching horses in the ranch yard brought Samuel to his feet with the alertness of a man whose nerves were already stretched thin. Through the frost-covered window, he could see Sheriff Tom Bradley dismounting from his horse, accompanied by a man Samuel didn't recognize, a thin, nervous-looking individual whose city clothes marked him as an outsider to the territory. "That's odd," Jake observed, peering through another window. Sheriff Bradley doesn't usually travel with strangers, especially not the kind that look like they'd rather be anywhere else but Wyoming. Samuel opened the door before the sheriff could knock, his military bearing and serious expression making it clear that this was not a social visit. Sheriff Bradley was a man Samuel respected, honest, competent, and not given to drama or unnecessary alarm. The fact that he had ridden out to the ranch in winter weather suggested urgent business. "Samuel," the sheriff said, touching the brim of his hat in greeting, "sorry to disturb you, but we've got a situation that might concern you. This here is Mr. Henry Caldwell from the Territorial Marshal's office in Cheyenne. He's been tracking some wanted men who may have passed through our area recently." Caldwell stepped forward with the uncomfortable air of a man accustomed to offices and courtrooms rather than frontier ranches. His pale complexion and soft hands marked him as someone who spent his time with papers and legal procedures rather than the harsh realities of territorial law enforcement. "Mr. Mackenzie," Caldwell began in a reedy voice, "I'm investigating the murder of a bounty hunter named Connor Walsh. His body was found 3 days ago in a ravine about 40 miles north of here. He'd been shot twice in the back, and his horse and equipment were missing." Samuel felt his blood turn cold, but years of controlling his emotions in business negotiations served him well now. He kept his expression neutral and interested, giving no sign that the name Connor Walsh meant anything to him personally. "Murder's a serious business," Samuel replied carefully, "but I'm not sure what it has to do with me or my ranch." Sheriff Bradley shifted uncomfortably, clearly reluctant to be part of what was obviously a fishing expedition. "Mr. Caldwell here thinks Walsh might have been carrying information about some criminals he was tracking. The thing is, we found evidence that Walsh had a trained dog with him, but the animal's missing. We're wondering if anyone in the area might have seen it." Samuel's mind raced through the implications of this revelation. If the authorities were looking for Rex, and if they connected the dog to the Mackenzie ranch, it could complicate any rescue attempt. Worse, it might put Margaret and his grandson in additional danger if word got back to Thomas Brennan or his associates that the law was involved. "What kind of criminals was this Walsh fellow tracking?" Samuel asked, trying to gather information without revealing his own knowledge. Caldwell consulted a small notebook he withdrew from his coat pocket. The primary target was a man named Thomas Brennan, wanted for fraud and embezzlement in Colorado. But Brennan's gotten involved with some dangerous associatessa gambling operation run by a man called Donovan, who's suspected of multiple murders. We believe Walsh was getting close to finding Brennan when he was killed. The confirmation of what Margaret's letter had already told him struck Samuel like a physical blow, but he forced himself to maintain his facade of casual interest. The situation was even worse than he had imagined. His daughter wasn't just married to a criminal, but to a criminal who was desperate enough to commit murder to avoid capture. "This dog you mentioned," Jake interjected, apparently thinking he was being helpful. "What kind of animal are we talking about? Lots of strays around in winter, looking for food and shelter." "According to our information, it was a large, dark-colored working dog, probably worth considerable money," Caldwell replied. "Extensively trained, the kind of animal that would stand out in a rural area like this. Walsh apparently used it to track his quarry and carry messages." Rex, lying quietly near the fireplace, seemed to sense the danger in the conversation. The dog remained perfectly still, but Samuel could see the tension in his posture and the alertness in his eyes. It was as if the animal understood that these strangers represented a threat to his mission and to the people he was now protecting. "We're asking all the ranchers in the area to keep an eye out for this dog," Sheriff Bradley added. "If Walsh was carrying important information about Brennan and his associates, that information might still be with the animal. It could be crucial evidence in solving this murder." Samuel realized with growing alarm that the authorities' investigation could destroy any chance of rescuing Margaret and his grandson quietly. If they found Rex and discovered the hidden letter, they would almost certainly want to use Margaret as bait to trap Thomas and his criminal associates. His daughter and grandson would become pawns in a larger game, with their safety secondary to the law's desire for justice. "There's something else," Caldwell continued, consulting his notebook again. We have reason to believe that Thomas Brennan may not be operating alone in this area. There have been reports of suspicious activity around several of the smaller towns, and we think he may be part of a larger criminal network that's been operating throughout the territory. The implications of this revelation sent a chill through Samuel's mind. If Thomas was part of an organized criminal enterprise, then rescuing Margaret and the child would be far more dangerous than he had initially calculated. Instead of dealing with one desperate man and his immediate associates, Samuel might be facing a coordinated network of professional criminals. What kind of suspicious activity? Samuel asked, though he dreaded the answer. Cattle rustling, bank robberies, stage hold-ups, Sheriff Bradley replied grimly. Nothing we can prove yet, but the pattern suggests coordination and planning. If Brennan's involved with this group, then Connor Walsh's murder might have been ordered from higher up the criminal hierarchy. Samuel's military experience had taught him to think tactically about complex problems, and he could see that the situation had just become exponentially more complicated. A simple rescue mission was now potentially a confrontation with an organized criminal network that had already demonstrated its willingness to kill to protect its interests. Rex chose that moment to shift position slightly, and the movement caught Caldwell's attention. The territorial marshal's representative looked directly at the dog with sudden interest, his eyes narrowing as he took in Rex's size, coloring, and obvious intelligence. "That's an interesting animal you have there, Mr. Mackenzie," Caldwell said slowly. "Large, dark-colored, well-trained by the look of him. Exactly the kind of dog we're looking for." Samuel felt the walls closing in around him, but his years of business negotiations had taught him to maintain composure under pressure. "Found him injured in the storm a few days ago," he replied truthfully. "Broken leg, half frozen. Seemed like the decent thing to do was nurse him back to health." "Mind if I take a closer look?" Caldwell asked, but his tone made it clear that this was not really a request. As Caldwell approached Rex, Samuel realized that the next few minutes would determine whether his rescue mission would proceed in secret or become part of a larger law enforcement operation that might or might not prioritize his family's safety. The dog's reaction to the stranger would either confirm or dispel Caldwell's suspicions, and Samuel found himself silently willing Rex to play the part of an ordinary ranch dog rather than the highly trained messenger he actually was. But Rex, with the intelligence that had impressed Samuel from the beginning, seemed to understand exactly what was required. As Caldwell approached, the dog struggled to his feet and wagged his tail with the friendly enthusiasm of any ranch dog greeting a visitor. His performance was so convincing that Samuel almost believed it himself. "Friendly fellow," Caldwell observed, though his tone suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. "You said you found him in the storm? Any idea where he might have come from?" "Could have come from anywhere," Samuel replied. "Storm like that, animals travel miles looking for shelter. Probably belonged to some settler family that got caught unprepared for winter." Caldwell spent several more minutes examining Rex, but the dog's convincing performance as an ordinary ranch animal seemed to satisfy his suspicions. Finally, the territorial marshal's representative stepped back with obvious disappointment. "Well, if you do come across the dog we're looking for, I'd appreciate you getting word to Sheriff Bradley immediately," Caldwell said. "The information that animal might be carrying could be crucial to solving this murder and preventing further crimes." As the two lawmen prepared to leave, Samuel realized that time was running out for any hope of a quiet rescue operation. Once word spread that the authorities were actively investigating Connor Walsh's murder and looking for his dog, Thomas Brennan and his associates would either disappear entirely or take desperate measures to protect themselves. Either way, Margaret and his grandson would be caught in the middle. As soon as the sheriff and territorial marshal's representative disappeared down the snow-covered trail, Samuel began preparations for what he now understood would be a race against time. The authorities' investigation had changed everything, transforming a family rescue mission into a desperate attempt to reach Margaret and his grandson before either the law or Thomas Brennan's criminal associates made the situation impossible. "Jake, get those men ready to ride immediately," Samuel ordered, his voice carrying the crisp authority of command. "We leave at first light, storm or no storm. And tell them to pack for trouble. This won't be a simple ride to Deadwood anymore." While Jake hurried to gather the chosen riders, Samuel retreated to his study to retrieve items he hadn't touched in over a decade. From a locked cabinet behind his desk, he withdrew a cavalry saber in a worn leather scabbard, its brass fittings tarnished, but the blade still sharp and true. The weapon had served him through 2 years of fighting during the Indian Wars, and the familiar weight of it in his hands brought back memories of younger days when survival had depended on quick decisions and quicker reflexes. The saber's presence in his study was a secret Samuel had kept from everyone, including Jake. It represented a part of his past that he had deliberately left behind when he came to Wyoming to build his ranch empire. But now, faced with the need to protect his family against dangerous criminals, the skills and instincts of his military service came flooding back with startling clarity. Beside the saber, wrapped in oiled cloth, lay other reminders of his soldiering days. A pair of field glasses that had helped him scout enemy positions, a compass that had guided him through hostile territory, and a small leather journal containing tactical notes and observations from his years as a cavalry officer. Samuel had been more than just a soldier. He had been a leader of men in dangerous situations, skilled in the arts of reconnaissance, strategy, and small unit tactics. Rex watched from his place by the fireplace as Samuel prepared for the mission, the dog's intelligent eyes following every movement with obvious understanding. Despite his injury, Rex struggled to his feet and approached Samuel with clear intention, his behavior indicating that he planned to be part of whatever action was coming. "I know you want to come, boy," Samuel said, kneeling beside the dog and examining the splintered leg. "But that broken bone isn't healed enough for hard travel, and where we're going might involve fighting." Rex responded by moving to the door and scratching at it with his good front paw, then looking back at Samuel with an expression that seemed to say he was ready for anything. The dog's determination reminded Samuel that Rex had already proven his courage and dedication by completing his original mission, despite injury and exhaustion. Dr. Harrison, who had remained at the ranch during the sheriff's visit, emerged from the kitchen where he had been preparing medical supplies for the journey. His weathered face showed concern not just for the mission's dangers, but for Samuel's emotional state as he confronted the reality of his estranged family's peril. "Samuel, I've put together what medical supplies I can spare," the doctor said, setting a leather satchel on the table. "But I have to scare you, sure you're thinking clearly about this. Charging into a situation like this could get everyone killed, including your daughter and grandson." Samuel looked up from checking his weapons, his eyes reflecting a cold determination that his friends had never seen before. "Doctor, I spent 2 years leading cavalry patrols against war parties that outnumbered us 3-1. I learned how to get men into impossible situations and bring them out alive. This isn't about charging blindly into danger. This is about using every skill I learned in the army to save my family." The transformation in Samuel's demeanor was remarkable. The methodical businessman had given way to something harder and more focused, a man accustomed to making life-and-death decisions under pressure. His movements became more efficient, his speech more direct, and his entire bearing suggested someone accustomed to command in dangerous situations. Tommy Patterson, Pedro Ramirez, and Old Bill Hawkins arrived within the hour, leading pack horses loaded with supplies for an extended journey. All 3 men had worked for Samuel long enough to recognize when their employer was serious about something, and the grim expression on his face left no doubt that this mission involved deadly stakes. "Boys," Samuel addressed them with military formality, "what I'm about to tell you stays between us, no matter what happens. My daughter and grandson are in trouble, serious trouble, and we're going to get them out. The men who are threatening them have already committed murder to protect their interests, so anyone who rides with me needs to understand that we might have to fight our way out." None of the 3 men hesitated in their commitment. Tommy Patterson, despite his youth, had proven his courage during a raid by cattle rustlers the previous spring. Pedro Ramirez had fought in range wars before coming to Wyoming, and his experience with violence would be valuable if shooting started. Old Bill Hawkins had survived the frontier for over 30 years by being both tough and smart, and his loyalty to Samuel was absolute. As the men prepared their gear and discussed the route to Deadwood, Samuel found himself thinking about the tactical challenges they would face. The town itself was controlled by criminal elements who would be hostile to any rescue attempt. Margaret's exact location was unknown, and approaching her directly might trigger violence that could result in her death or that of his grandson. Most importantly, time was running out if Thomas Brennan decided to run, or if the authorities' investigation spooked his criminal associates, the window for rescue might close permanently. The weather remained a constant concern. The blizzard that had brought Rex to the ranch was part of a larger storm system that continued to move across the territory. Travel would be slow and dangerous, and the cold could kill as effectively as bullets if they weren't careful. Samuel studied the sky and wind patterns with the expertise of a man who had learned to read weather signs during his military service, and what he saw suggested that conditions would remain harsh for several more days. Rex's determination to join the mission posed another tactical problem. The dog's knowledge of Connor Walsh's investigation and the criminal network they were facing could be invaluable, but his injury made him a potential liability in a fast-moving situation. Samuel wrestled with the decision until Rex solved the problem himself by demonstrating that he could move effectively despite the splintered leg, his intelligence and training compensating for his physical limitations. "All right, boy," Samuel finally decided. "You've earned the right to finish what your master started, but you follow orders and stay back if the shooting starts." As darkness fell over the ranch, Samuel gathered his men around the kitchen table to plan their approach to Deadwood. Using his military experience, he outlined a strategy that would minimize their exposure to danger while maximizing their chances of locating and rescuing Margaret and the child. "We go in quiet," Samuel explained, tracing routes on a hand-drawn map of the area around Deadwood. "Pedro knows the country, so he'll guide us to a campsite outside town where we can observe without being seen. Tommy and Bill will watch the horses and maintain our escape route, while Pedro and I scout the situation." The plan was methodical and careful, designed to gather intelligence before committing to action. But Samuel knew that no plan survived contact with the enemy unchanged, and he prepared contingencies for various scenarios, including the possibility that they might arrive too late to prevent disaster. Old Bill Hawkins, who had seen his share of dangerous situations, studied Samuel's face in the lamplight and recognized something that reminded him of his own military service during the Civil War. "Mr. Mackenzie," he said quietly, "I've ridden with officers before, and I can tell you've got the look of a man who's led soldiers in bad places. These boys and I will follow wherever you lead." As the night deepened and the final preparations were completed, Samuel found himself standing at his study window, looking out at the snow-covered landscape that would soon become the backdrop for the most important mission of his life. The photograph of Margaret and his grandson remained in his pocket, a constant reminder of what was at stake and why failure was not an option. Rex settled beside him, the dog's presence a comforting reminder that they were not alone in their mission. Together, they had already overcome seemingly impossible odds to deliver Margaret's message and begin the process of rescue. Tomorrow would test whether their partnership could complete the mission that Connor Walsh had died trying to accomplish. The journey to Deadwood took 2.5 days through snow-choked mountain passes and wind-scoured valleys that tested both men and horses to their limits. Samuel set a pace that balanced urgency with the need to arrive with enough strength left to fight, if necessary. Rex, despite his splintered leg, managed to keep up with the horses by riding in the supply wagon during the worst terrain and walking during easier stretches. On the afternoon of the second day, they reached the ridge overlooking Deadwood Gulch, and Samuel felt his heart sink at what he saw through his field glasses. The town sprawled along the narrow valley floor like a festering wound, its muddy streets crowded with the kind of desperate characters who were drawn to gold mining camps and gambling dens. Smoke from countless chimneys created a permanent haze that hung over the settlement, and even at a distance, Samuel could sense the lawlessness and violence that permeated the place. "There," Pedro said quietly, pointing to a cluster of ramshackle buildings on the town's eastern edge. "That's where the gambling operations run by this Donovan fellow are supposed to be located. If your daughter's husband is mixed up with that crowd, that's where we'll likely find them." Samuel studied the buildings through his glasses, noting the strategic positions of guards and the layout of streets that could serve as escape routes or potential traps. His military training automatically catalogued defensive positions, fields of fire, and the tactical advantages and disadvantages of various approaches to the target area. They established their camp in a sheltered ravine 3 miles from town, hidden from casual observation but close enough to allow quick movement when the time came for action. Samuel assigned watches and established signals for communication, falling back on military procedures that had kept him alive during his cavalry days. As evening approached, Samuel and Pedro prepared for their reconnaissance mission into Deadwood. Both men wore rough clothing that would help them blend in with the town's transient population, and they carried weapons concealed beneath heavy coats. Rex insisted on accompanying them despite Samuel's concerns about his injury, and the dog's determination finally convinced Samuel that his local knowledge and tracking abilities might prove crucial. The streets of Deadwood after dark were a maze of mud, vice, and barely controlled violence. Samuel and Pedro moved carefully through the crowds of miners, gamblers, and criminals, their senses alert for any sign of immediate danger while they searched for information about Margaret's whereabouts. Rex stayed close to Samuel's side, his intelligent eyes scanning the crowds and his nose working constantly to pick up familiar scents. The first 3 saloons they visited yielded nothing but suspicious stares, and the kind of atmosphere that suggested strangers asking questions weren't welcome. But in the 4th establishment, a grimy dive called the Lucky Strike, Pedro struck up a conversation with a bartender who proved more talkative after the application of whiskey and silver coins. "Thomas Brennan?" the bartender repeated when Pedro casually mentioned the name. "Yeah, I know him. Owes money all over town, but he's been keeping close to Donovan's operation lately. Word is he's got something Donovan wants, some kind of arrangement that's keeping him breathing despite his debts." Samuel felt his blood run cold at the implication. If Thomas was using Margaret and the child as leverage in his dealings with Donovan, then their situation was even more dangerous than the letter had suggested. He exchanged glances with Pedro, both men understanding that time was running shorter than they had hoped. "You wouldn't happen to know where Brennan's been staying, would you?" Pedro asked casually. "Friend of mine's been looking for him about a business matter." The bartender's eyes narrowed with suspicion, but another coin convinced him to continue talking. "There's a cabin about 2 miles up Canyon Creek, past the old mine works. Used to belong to a prospector who died last winter. Brennan's been holed up there with his woman and kid, but there's usually a couple of Donovan's boys keeping an eye on the place." As they left the saloon, Samuel's mind was already working on the tactical problem of approaching a guarded cabin in hostile territory. The location the bartender had described was isolated enough to allow for a quiet approach, but it also meant that any rescue attempt would be far from potential help if things went wrong. Rex suddenly tensed beside Samuel, his nose working furiously as he caught a scent that clearly meant something significant to him. The dog began pulling toward a narrow alley between 2 buildings, his behavior indicating that he had found a trail he recognized. Following Rex into the alley, Samuel discovered something that made his heart race with both hope and fear. Lying discarded in the mud was a small gold wedding ring, tarnished and bent, as if it had been thrown away in anger or desperation. Samuel picked it up with shaking hands, recognizing it immediately as the ring he had given Margaret's mother on their wedding day 26 years earlier. Margaret had treasured that ring after her mother's death, wearing it on a chain around her neck as a remembrance of the parent she had lost too young. The fact that it was now lying abandoned in a Deadwood alley told a story of violence and despair that filled Samuel with rage and desperate urgency. "She's been here," Samuel whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Recently, by the look of it, Rex found her trail." Pedro examined the ring and the surrounding area with the practiced eye of a man who had tracked both animals and humans across difficult terrain. "The mud's fresh," he observed. "Whatever happened here, it was within the last day or two, and look at this." He pointed to scuff marks in the dirt that suggested a struggle had taken place. Rex continued to work the scent trail, leading them deeper into the maze of alleys and back streets that formed Deadwood's hidden geography. His behavior became increasingly agitated as they progressed, suggesting that whatever he was following was recent and significant to his mission. The trail led them to the rear of a two-story building that appeared to serve as both saloon and boarding house. Through a grimy window, Samuel could see men gathered around gaming tables, their rough voices and harsh laughter creating an atmosphere of barely contained violence. This was clearly one of Donovan's establishments, and the presence of armed guards at both the front and rear entrances confirmed its importance to the criminal organization. As they watched from the shadows, Samuel saw something that made his blood freeze in his veins. Through an upper-story window, he caught a glimpse of a woman's silhouette figure that moved with the grace and bearing he remembered from his daughter's childhood. Margaret was inside that building, probably being held against her will as leverage in Thomas Brennan's desperate negotiations with his creditors. "We need to get closer," Samuel whispered to Pedro. "I need to know exactly where she is and how many men are guarding her." But before they could move, the sound of approaching footsteps made them retreat deeper into the shadows. Two men emerged from the building's rear entrance, their conversation clearly audible in the cold night air. "Donovan's getting impatient," one of them said. "If Brennan can't pay up by tomorrow night, the boss says we settle the debt his own way. The woman's pretty enough to bring good money in the right market, and the kid can always be sold to someone looking for cheap labor." The casual brutality of their plans struck Samuel like a physical blow. These men were discussing the sale of his daughter and grandson as if they were livestock, and their matter-of-fact tone suggested that such transactions were routine business for Donovan's organization. Samuel's hand moved instinctively to the cavalry saber at his side, and for a moment Pedro thought his companion might charge the guards immediately, despite the tactical disadvantages. But Samuel's military training held, forcing him to control his emotions and think strategically about how to rescue his family without getting them killed in the process. The two guards continued their conversation as they walked past the alley where Samuel and his companions were hidden. "Brennan keeps begging for more time, says he's got money coming from some business deal. But Donovan's heard that song before. Tomorrow night, one way or another, this gets settled." As the guards disappeared around the corner, Samuel realized that their window for rescue had narrowed to less than 24 hours. Whatever plan they implemented would have to be executed quickly and flawlessly, because failure would result in his daughter and grandson disappearing into a criminal underworld from which they might never emerge. Samuel's plan was born from his cavalry experience and refined by desperation. As dawn broke over Deadwood, he positioned his men according to a strategy that would create maximum confusion while minimizing risk to Margaret and his grandson. Tommy and Old Bill were stationed with the horses at predetermined rally points, ready to provide covering fire and secure escape routes. Pedro would create a distraction at the front of the building while Samuel approached from the rear. Rex proved to be more valuable than Samuel had anticipated. The dog's exceptional training allowed him to serve as a silent scout, moving through the building's lower levels and identifying the positions of guards with remarkable accuracy. When Rex returned from his reconnaissance, his behavior clearly indicated that he had located not only Margaret and the child, but also the best route for reaching them. The assault began at precisely noon, when the saloon would be crowded with customers, but before the serious gambling and drinking of the evening shift. Pedro's distraction, a carefully staged fight that quickly escalated into a general brawl, drew most of the guards away from their positions, giving Samuel the opening he needed to enter the building through a rear window that Rex had identified as unguarded. The interior of the building was even worse than Samuel had imagined. The stench of unwashed bodies, cheap whiskey, and fear created an atmosphere that spoke of human misery and degradation. Samuel moved through the corridors with the silent efficiency of a man trained in close-quarters combat, his cavalry saber ready but concealed beneath his coat. Rex led him up a narrow staircase to the second floor, where the sounds of the distraction below provided cover for their movement. At the end of a dimly lit hallway, the dog stopped before a heavy wooden door and looked back at Samuel with obvious meaning. Samuel pressed his ear to the door and heard voices inside, a woman's voice raised in desperate argument, a man's sullen responses, and most heartbreakingly, the frightened whimpering of a small child. His daughter and grandson were inside, but they weren't alone. "I won't let you sell us to pay your debts, Thomas." Margaret's voice carried clearly through the thin door. "I'd rather die first, and I'll make sure little Samuel dies with me before I let you turn him into a slave." "You don't have a choice," Thomas Brennan replied, his voice slurred with drink and desperation. "Donovan's made it clear what happens if I don't pay up. At least this way you'll be alive, and maybe the boy will have a chance to grow up, even if it's not the life you planned." Samuel had heard enough. With Rex at his side, he tested the door and found it secured only by a simple wooden latch. His military training had taught him the value of surprise, and he prepared to use every advantage his experience could provide. The door burst open with explosive force, and Samuel stepped into the room with his saber drawn and his presence commanding immediate attention. Thomas Brennan, a thin man with the pallid complexion of someone who spent his time in saloons and gambling dens, looked up from a bottle of whiskey with shock and growing fear. Margaret's gasp of recognition was followed by a cry of joy and disbelief. "Papa, how could you possibly—" But there was no time for explanations. Samuel could hear footsteps on the stairs below, indicating that the distraction had failed to hold all of the guards' attention. He moved quickly to Margaret's side, noting with rage the bruises on her face and arms that spoke of recent violence. In the corner of the room, his grandson cowered behind a crude wooden toy horse, his 3-year-old mind unable to process the sudden appearance of a stranger in their desperate situation. The child's fear and confusion struck Samuel with unexpected force, reminding him that this little boy had never known safety or security in his short life. "Get away from my wife," Thomas snarled, producing a pistol from beneath his coat. "I don't know who you are, mister, but this is none of your business." Samuel's response was swift and decisive. The cavalry saber moved in a precise arc that knocked the pistol from Thomas's hand before the man could aim it properly. A second movement brought the blade's point to rest against Thomas's throat, pressing just hard enough to draw a thin line of blood. "I'm Margaret's father," Samuel said in a voice that carried all the authority of his military training and the cold fury of a man protecting his family. "And you, Thomas Brennan, are the coward who's been beating my daughter and threatening to sell my grandson into slavery." The sound of approaching footsteps grew louder, and Samuel knew their time was running out. Rex had positioned himself at the door, ready to warn of approaching danger, but the dog's tense posture indicated that several men were climbing the stairs. "Margaret, take the boy and get behind me," Samuel ordered, never taking his eyes off Thomas. "We're leaving, and anyone who tries to stop us will answer to this blade." Margaret scooped up little Samuel, who clung to her with the desperate grip of a frightened child. The wooden toy horse remained clutched in his small hands, apparently his only comfort in a world that had shown him little kindness. "You can't just take them," Thomas protested, though his voice shook with fear. "Donovan will hunt you down and kill you all. He doesn't forgive debts, and he doesn't let people interfere with his business." Samuel's smile was cold and dangerous. "Let him try. I've dealt with men like Donovan before, and they usually discover that some people are harder to kill than they expect." The first of Donovan's men appeared in the doorway, and Samuel's military training took over completely. The saber moved with deadly precision, disabling the first attacker before he could draw his weapon. Rex launched himself at the second man, his powerful jaws clamping down on the gunman's wrist and preventing him from using his pistol. "Move!" Samuel shouted to Margaret, indicating the window that led to the roof of an adjacent building. His plan had always included this escape route, and he had positioned Pedro and the others to provide covering fire from predetermined positions. Margaret didn't hesitate, climbing through the window with her son in her arms and trusting her father to protect their escape. Samuel followed, but not before delivering a final message to Thomas Brennan. "If I ever see you again," Samuel said quietly, "or if you ever come anywhere near my daughter and grandson, I'll kill you." That's not a threat, Thomas sees a promise from a man who's kept many such promises in his lifetime. The escape across Deadwood's rooftops was harrowing but successful, with Pedro and the others providing the covering fire that allowed the family to reach their horses safely. As they rode hard out of town, Samuel looked back to see smoke rising from the saloon where their rescue had taken place, evidence that their departure had not gone unnoticed. The journey back to the Mackenzie ranch took 4 days, slowed by the need to care for Margaret's injuries and accommodate little Samuel's needs. The boy had initially been terrified of the grandfather he'd never met, clinging to his mother and watching Samuel with wide, fearful eyes. But gradually, as Samuel's patient kindness and quiet strength provided the security the child had never known, young Samuel began to respond with tentative trust. On the second night of their journey, as they camped in a sheltered valley miles from Deadwood, Margaret finally found the courage to address the years of silence that had stood between her and her father. The firelight played across her bruised face as she struggled to find words that could bridge the gap created by pride and misunderstanding. "Papa," she began hesitantly, "I need you to know how wrong I was about everything, about Thomas, about love, about what really matters in life. I said terrible things to you, accused you of being cold and unfeeling, when the truth was that you were trying to protect me from exactly what happened." Samuel, who had spent 4 years replaying their final argument and wondering if his daughter's accusations contained more truth than he wanted to admit, felt a weight lifting from his heart. "Margaret, we both said things we regret. I should have found a way to show you how much I loved you, instead of hiding behind practical concerns and stern warnings." Little Samuel, who had been playing quietly with his wooden toy horse near the fire, looked up at the sound of his name and saw his grandfather watching him with gentle eyes. For the first time since their rescue, the boy smiled a tentative, uncertain expression that nonetheless filled Samuel with more joy than all his business successes combined. "What's your horse's name?" Samuel asked, kneeling beside his grandson and examining the crude wooden toy with serious attention. "Thunder," the boy whispered, his voice barely audible but carrying the first word he had spoken directly to his grandfather. "Thunder's a good name for a horse," Samuel replied gravely. "When we get home, would you like to meet some real horses? I have a mare named Belle who's very gentle with children." The transformation in young Samuel's expression was remarkable. The fear and wariness that had marked his features since birth began to give way to something Samuel had never expected to seethe, natural curiosity and enthusiasm of a healthy child, discovering that the world might contain wonders instead of only dangers. Rex, whose splintered leg had healed remarkably well during their adventures, seemed to understand that his mission was nearing completion. The dog had appointed himself as young Samuel's protector, staying close to the boy during the day and sleeping beside him at night. The bond between them reminded Samuel of the loyalty and dedication that had brought Rex through the blizzard to deliver Margaret's desperate message. When they finally reached the Mackenzie ranch, Samuel was amazed by the reception that awaited them. Word of their return had somehow preceded them, and the entire crew had gathered in the ranch yard to welcome home their employer and meet the family they had never known existed. Jake Morrison, Old Bill Hawkins, Tommy Patterson, and Pedro Ramirez stood with obvious pride at having participated in the successful rescue mission. Dr. Harrison was waiting with medical supplies to treat Margaret's injuries and examine young Samuel to ensure that his ordeal hadn't caused lasting physical damage. The physician's gentle manner and evident concern helped both mother and child begin to understand that they were truly safe for the first time in years. "The boy's remarkably resilient," Dr. Harrison told Samuel privately after completing his examination. Children have an amazing capacity to heal from trauma when they're placed in a loving, secure environment. With time and patience, he'll overcome the effects of what he's experienced. The ranch house, which had seemed so empty and echoing during Samuel's years of solitude, came alive with the presence of family. Margaret's laughter, heard for the first time in years, filled the rooms with warmth that no fireplace could provide. Young Samuel's delighted squeals as he explored his new home and met the ranch animals created a joy that Samuel had forgotten was possible. Over the following weeks, as winter gradually gave way to spring, the healing process continued for all of them. Margaret slowly regained her strength and confidence, finding in her father's steady presence the security she had sought in her disastrous marriage. Young Samuel blossomed under the combined attention of his grandfather, mother, and the ranch hands who competed to spoil him with attention and small gifts. Rex, his leg fully healed and his mission completed, settled into ranch life with the contentment of a working dog who had found his proper place. He became young Samuel's constant companion and protector, teaching the boy about loyalty, courage, and the bonds that could exist between different species, united by affection and trust. Samuel found that fatherhood and grandfatherhood in his 50s brought challenges and rewards he had never anticipated. Teaching young Samuel to ride, watching Margaret rediscover her strength and independence, and sharing the stories of 3 generations created a richness in his life that all his business success had never provided. On a warm spring evening, 6 months after the rescue, Samuel sat on his front porch, watching his grandson play in the yard under Rex's watchful supervision. Margaret was preparing dinner in the kitchen, her voice raised in a song Samuel remembered from her childhood. The photograph that had started their reunion now sat in a place of honor on the mantelpiece, joined by new pictures that documented their growing life together. Jake Morrison approached the porch with the day's reports, but instead of discussing business matters, he paused to watch young Samuel's antics with obvious affection. "You know, Mr. Mackenzie," Jake said thoughtfully, "I've worked for you for 14 years, and I've never seen you as happy as you've been these past few months. That boy and his mother have been the making of you." Samuel nodded, understanding that Jake was right. The methodical, controlled man who had built the ranch empire had been transformed by the simple act of opening his heart to family love. The rescue mission that had seemed like the most dangerous adventure of his life had actually been the beginning of the most rewarding chapter. As the sun set over the Wyoming landscape, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Samuel reflected on the unexpected ways that life could change. A blizzard that had seemed like nature's cruelty had brought Rex to his door. A desperate message hidden in a dog's collar had reunited him with the family he thought he had lost forever. Sometimes, he realized, the most important moments in life truly did come when they were least expected. Young Samuel ran up to the porch, his wooden toy horse clutched in one hand and a wildflower in the other, both offerings for the grandfather who had become the hero of his small world. Rex followed close behind, his tail wagging with the contentment of a dog who had completed the most important mission of his life and found a permanent home in the process. "Grandpa," young Samuel said, using the title that never failed to fill Samuel's heart with warmth. "Rex and I found something special to show you." As Samuel knelt to examine his grandson's treasures and listen to the excited story of their discovery, he understood that this was what Connor Walsh had died to protect, not just the lives of a woman and child, but the possibility of love, healing, and second chances that made all their sacrifices worthwhile. The storm-weathered wagon still sat in the barn, ready for whatever adventures the future might bring, but it would never again carry a more precious cargo than the family it had helped to rescue and reunite.